Burma, April 1944. The convoy was dying, and Marcus Webb could smell it burning. Not the acrid stench of enemy fire or the sulfur reek of exploded shells. This was different. This was the sweet, nauseating odor of engine oil cooking itself to death in cylinder blocks never designed for jungle heat. 37 GMC CCKW trucks stretched along the muddy serpent of the Ledo Road, and by Marcus's count, 19 of them were already hemorrhaging their lifeblood onto the red Burmese clay. The morning mist clung to the valley like funeral shroud, refusing to burn away even as the sun climbed higher. Marcus stood beside the lead truck, his hands black with grease up to the elbows, staring at the engine block like a doctor examining a terminal patient. Behind him, he could hear Lieutenant Patterson's boots squelching through the mud, each step a countdown to the conversation Marcus had been dreading since 0400 hours. "Sergeant Webb." Patterson's voice carried the particular exhaustion of a man who'd stopped sleeping 3 weeks ago. "Tell me something I want to hear." Marcus didn't turn around. His fingers traced the heat-warped metal of the engine casing, feeling the wrongness of it like a fever beneath skin. "Sir, the oil's breaking down. Heat's too much for it. We're running at temperatures these engines never saw in Detroit, and the lubricant's turning to syrup, then to nothing." "I didn't ask for a mechanical dissertation, Sergeant. I asked for solutions." Now Marcus did turn, and in the gray light, he could see what the last month had done to Patterson. The lieutenant had been fresh from officer training when they'd shipped out, smooth-faced, confident, full of theories about supply lines and strategic positioning. The jungle had carved that confidence away like a knife stripping bark from a tree. What remained was something harder, more desperate. "Sir, we need proper oil. The high-viscosity grade we were supposed to receive in Ledo. Without it, we improvise." Patterson stepped closer, close enough that Marcus could smell the malaria tablets on his breath. "Because in approximately 4 hours, a column of Chinese infantry is going to reach this position. They're carrying wounded, they're low on ammunition, and they're expecting us to have supplies waiting for them 20 miles up this road." Marcus looked past the lieutenant to where the rest of the convoy stretched into the mist. He could see other men working on other engines, Jackson with his head buried in a carburetor, Rodriguez lying on his back beneath a differential, young Thompson just sitting on a running board with his head in his hands because his truck had seized completely an hour ago. They were all colored men. Every mechanic, every driver in this god-forsaken supply convoy. The 823rd Engineer Aviation Battalion might have been doing the real work in Burma, building the road, moving the supplies, keeping the war machine grinding forward, but nobody back home would ever know their names. They'd remember the white generals, the white pilots, maybe even the white infantry, but not the men who kept the trucks running. "Lieutenant," Marcus said carefully, "I understand the situation, but I can't manufacture oil out of jungle air." Patterson's jaw worked silently for a moment. Then, "Figure something out, Sergeant. That's an order." He walked away, leaving Marcus alone with the impossible. The sun was fully up now, burning through the mist and shafts that turned the jungle canopy into stained glass. Somewhere in the distance, a gibbon screamed, a sound like a human child crying. Marcus had stopped flinching at it weeks ago. Now it was just another voice in the symphony of things that wanted to kill you in Burma. The Japanese, the disease, the terrain, the climate, and the slow mechanical failure of everything the American war machine sent into this green hell. Marcus pulled a rag from his pocket and wiped his hands, knowing it was futile. The grease had worked itself into the lines of his palms, the whorls of his fingerprints. His hands hadn't been clean since they'd crossed into Burma. His hands. His father's hands, really. Otis Webb had been a mechanic too, working in a colored garage in South Philadelphia, keeping the neighborhood's cars running on hope and improvisation, because nobody with dark skin could afford genuine parts. Marcus had grown up in that garage, learning to listen to engines the way other children learned to read. An engine would tell you what it needed if you knew how to hear it. "Hey, Sarge." Jackson appeared at his elbow, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Thompson's truck just threw a rod. That's 20 down. 20 out of 37. More than half the convoy." Marcus walked the line, moving from truck to truck, examining each one with the focused intensity of a man looking for a miracle in a machine. The GMC 2.5-ton trucks were good vehicles, reliable, sturdy, the backbone of American logistics, but they weren't designed for this. Nobody had designed anything for this. The Ledo Road was supposed to be a supply line, a lifeline connecting India to China through the mountains and jungles of northern Burma. On paper, it was a triumph of engineering. In reality, it was a 478-mile wound carved through terrain that actively rejected human presence. The mud could swallow a truck to its axles in minutes. The rain fell with the weight of biblical punishment, and the heat turned metal into taffy and oil into water. Marcus knelt beside one of the trucks, watching a drop of oil drip from the pan onto the ground. It spread slowly, too slowly. Cooked, degraded, useless. In his mind, he heard his father's voice. "When you ain't got what you need, boy, you figure out what you got." He looked around the jungle clearing. Bamboo, teak, vines thick as a man's arm. And somewhere probably locals who knew how to survive in this place that killed everything American. An idea began to form. Ridiculous, desperate, probably impossible. But it was an idea. Marcus stood and called out, "Jackson, Rodriguez, get me a detail of 6 men, and find me someone who speaks Burmese." 30 minutes later, Marcus was leading a small group through the jungle fringe, following a track that might have been a path or might have been a tiger trail. Private Chen, a Chinese-American kid from San Francisco who spoke a little of everything, walked beside him. "Sergeant, you mind telling us what we're looking for?" "A village," Marcus said. "There's got to be settlements out here. People who've lived in this jungle for generations. And when we find them, we're going to ask them how they keep things from seizing up in this heat." They found the village an hour later, a cluster of bamboo structures raised on stilts, surrounded by carefully tended fields. An old man appeared first, then others, watching the American soldiers with the wary neutrality of people who'd seen too many armies pass through. Chen stepped forward, speaking in halting Burmese. The conversation went back and forth, Marcus catching none of the words but all of the skepticism. Finally, Chen turned back. "He says they use palm oil for everything, cooking, lamps, even lubricating their tools and cartwheels. He thinks we're crazy for asking about truck engines." "Palm oil," Marcus repeated. His mind was already racing through viscosity ratings, heat tolerance, molecular structures. "Ask him if it can handle high temperatures without breaking down." More conversation. The old man gestured to a cooking fire where something was frying in a dark pan, the oil bubbling at temperatures that would have human skin blistering. "He says it's been keeping their ancestors' tools working for 1,000 years. Marcus looked at the village, at the simple technology that had outlasted empires. Then he looked back toward where the convoy sat dying in the morning heat. "Ask him if he'll trade. We've got rations, cigarettes, whatever they need. We need oil. A lot of it." The negotiation took another hour. By the time they returned to the convoy, Marcus and his men were carrying clay jars full of dark, viscous liquid that smelled nothing like the petroleum products that had failed them. Lieutenant Patterson stared at the jars like Marcus had brought back snake venom. "Cooking oil," he said flatly. "Palm oil, sir. High smoke point, stable at extreme temperatures, natural lubricant properties." Marcus was already moving toward the nearest truck. "It's what the locals use on everything mechanical. If it can survive in this climate, it might just work for us." "Might." "It's what we've got, sir." Patterson was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Do it." "But if this ruins the engines, Sergeant, I'm putting it in my report that this was your call." Marcus almost smiled, as if anyone would read a report about colored mechanics using cooking oil to save a convoy, as if anyone would care. He gathered his men and began the desperate work of draining the ruined petroleum oil and replacing it with palm oil. Truck by truck, engine by engine, they worked through the afternoon heat. Marcus showed them how to check the consistency, how much to add, how to look for the telltale signs of proper lubrication. When they fired up the first engine, Marcus held his breath. The GMC roared to life, rough at first, then smoothing out. The temperature gauge climbed, held, then stabilized. Marcus listened to the engine's voice, really listened, the way his father had taught him, and heard something that might have been hope. By sunset, they had 18 trucks running again. 19. 20. Patterson stood beside Marcus as the convoy prepared to move out, watching the impossible become real. "How long will it hold?" the lieutenant asked quietly. "I don't know, sir. Maybe 50 miles. Maybe 500. Marcus wiped his hands again, the gesture automatic and useless. "But it'll hold long enough to get those Chinese soldiers their supplies." The convoy rolled forward as darkness fell, engines running on hope and cooking oil, and the kind of desperate ingenuity that wars are actually won with, even if the history books never mention it. Marcus rode in the lead truck, listening to the engine sing its strange new song, and wondered if his father would have been proud or just laughed at the absurdity of it all. The jungle closed in around them, and somewhere ahead, men were waiting for what only they could bring. The convoy drove on. The Ledo road had a way of making time meaningless. Marcus had been riding in the lead truck for what felt like hours or minutes. He couldn't tell anymore. The jungle on both sides pressed so close that bamboo branches scraped against the canvas cover with sounds like fingernails on skin. Every few minutes, the convoy would slow to navigate another crater, another mudslide, another section where the road had simply decided to become river. Behind him, 20 trucks followed in a line that stretched back into the gathering darkness like a chain of dim fireflies. 20 trucks running on cooking oil and prayer. Marcus kept his window down despite the mosquitoes, listening to each engine as they passed checkpoints. Listening for the first sign of failure. Private Rodriguez appeared in the side mirror, jogging up from the third truck. Marcus signaled the driver to slow. "Sarge, we got a problem." Rodriguez was breathing hard, sweat cutting clean lines through the dust on his face. "Truck 7 is running hot, real hot. Temperature gauge is in the red." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "How long?" "Started about 10 minutes ago. Jackson's been watching it, but it's climbing." The convoy couldn't stop. Not here, not in the open with night falling fast. But if Truck 7's engine seized, it would block the entire line on a road barely wide enough for one vehicle. Marcus made the decision in 3 seconds. "Tell Jackson to drop back to last position. If it dies, we can't have it blocking the column. And get me a runner every 5 minutes with updates." Rodriguez nodded and disappeared back into the line. Marcus pulled out his canteen, took a drink that tasted like rust and iodine, and tried not to think about what palm oil looked like at 300 degrees. The driver beside him, a kid from Georgia named Williams, hadn't said a word since they'd left the village. Now he cleared his throat. "Sarge, can I ask you something? Long as you keep driving. Why'd they put us all in the same unit? I mean, all colored men, all mechanics. Seems like they could have spread us around." Marcus had heard this question before, in a dozen different forms, from a dozen different men who were just starting to understand what the war really thought of them. "Army doesn't want us spread around, Williams. They want us contained, separate. Easy to forget about when things go right, easy to blame when they go wrong. But we're doing the same work as anyone. That's exactly why they're afraid of us." Williams was quiet for a moment, negotiating the truck around a fallen teak tree that maintenance crews hadn't cleared yet. "My daddy told me the Army would make me into something, that I'd come home and folks would respect me." "Your daddy lied to you. But that don't mean you can't make yourself into something anyway." The radio crackled to life, Lieutenant Patterson's voice cutting through static. "Lead vehicle, this is command. What's our ETA to rendezvous point?" Marcus checked his watch, calculated distances against the crawling pace they'd maintained. "Command, estimate 4 hours at current speed, maybe 5 if the road gets worse." "It's going to get worse, Sergeant." "Scouts report the bridge at kilometer marker 43 is partially collapsed. You'll need to ford the river." Of course, because a convoy running on cooking oil definitely needed to drive through a river. "Copy that, Command. We'll manage." "You always do, Sergeant. That's why you're out there." Patterson paused. "How are the engines holding?" Marcus thought about Truck 7 running hot, about the palm oil that might be breaking down right now in 19 other engine blocks, about the Chinese soldiers waiting for supplies they might never receive. "Engines are fine, sir. Web out." He hung up the radio before Patterson could ask anything else. The convoy pushed deeper into the night. The jungle sounds changed as darkness completed its takeover. Daybirds replaced by nightbirds, the insect chorus shifting to a lower, more ominous register. Somewhere in the distance, Marcus heard the unmistakable cough of a tiger. The sound made Williams grip the steering wheel tighter. Rodriguez appeared again, running alongside the truck. "Truck 7 dropped to yellow, Sarge. Jackson says whatever you did, it's working. Tell Jackson to keep monitoring. And tell him to check the oil level every 30 minutes. If it's burning off faster than regular oil, we need to know." Another hour passed. The bridge appeared in the headlights like a broken promise. Half the span had collapsed into the river below, leaving only twisted metal and splintered wood reaching toward the far bank like a beggar's hand. Marcus called a halt and walked to the river's edge with Patterson and Jackson. The water moved fast, swollen from recent rains, carrying branches and debris in a current that could flip a truck if the driver wasn't careful. "How deep?" Patterson asked. Jackson was already wading in, probing with a long stick. 3 feet at the edges, maybe 4 in the middle. Current strong, but the bottom looks solid. We can ford it, but we'll need to go one at a time, slow and steady. Marcus studied the far bank, calculating angles and approach vectors the way his father had taught him to read a tricky parking job. "We'll need to hit it at an angle, let the current help push us across rather than fight it, and we disconnect the convoy. Each truck goes independent. If one gets stuck, we can't have it dragging others down." Patterson looked at the dark water, at the ruined bridge, at the 20 trucks waiting behind them. "Your call, Sergeant. You know these vehicles better than I do." It was the first time Patterson had said that out loud, the first time he'd admitted that the colored mechanic might know something the white officer didn't. Marcus took the first truck across himself, Williams white-knuckling the wheel as water rose halfway up the doors, and the current shoved them sideways. The engine coughed once, twice, then caught and roared. They climbed the far bank with water streaming from the undercarriage, and Marcus released a breath he hadn't known he was holding. One by one, the convoy crossed. Marcus stood on the far side, watching each truck fight the current, listening to each engine strain against the water. Truck 9 stalled halfway across and had to be winched out by Truck 10. Truck 15 took the angle too sharp and nearly rolled, saved only by Rodriguez's quick work with a tow cable. But they made it. All 20 trucks, dripping and muddy but running. As the last vehicle climbed the bank, Jackson approached Marcus with something in his hand. A dipstick, gleaming wet in the moonlight. "You need to see this, Sarge." Marcus took the stick, held it up to the truck's headlights. The oil coating it was darker than it should be. Thicker. But it was still oil. Still lubricating. Still doing its impossible job. "It's picking up water," Jackson said. "Just a little, from the humidity and the river crossing. But it's not emulsifying. It's not breaking down." Marcus stared at the dipstick like it was a message from God. Palm oil, used by Burmese villagers for 1,000 years, was outperforming American petroleum engineering in the one place the engineers had never tested, the actual jungle. "Check all the trucks," Marcus said quietly. "I want to know if this is consistent or if we just got lucky." The convoy rolled on. The road climbed into the mountains, the jungle giving way to pine forests that smelled almost like home. Almost, but not quite, because home didn't have Japanese patrols in the trees or the constant threat of ambush around every curve. They passed abandoned equipment on the roadside, a burned-out British lorry, an overturned American Jeep, a Chinese tank with flowers growing through the turret hatch. Each piece of wreckage was a reminder that the road took what it wanted, when it wanted. Near midnight, they reached a switchback where the road clung to the mountainside like a prayer. Marcus called another halt, partly for the men to rest, partly because he needed to see what the last 6 hours had done to the engines. The mechanics spread out, checking oil levels, listening for knocks and pings, searching for leaks. Marcus moved from truck to truck, his trained ear catching every irregularity, every variation from normal operation. At truck 12, he found Private Thompson sitting on the running board, staring at nothing. The kid looked like he'd aged 10 years since morning. "Engine running good, Thompson?" "Yes, Sergeant. Running fine." But Thompson's voice was hollow. Marcus sat down beside him. This was the part of being a sergeant nobody taught you in training. The part where you had to be more than just a mechanic, more than just an order giver. You had to be the thing that kept men from breaking when everything else already had. What's on your mind, son? Thompson was quiet for so long Marcus thought he wouldn't answer. Then, my truck seized this morning, Sarge. Locked up completely, and I sat there. Didn't know what to do. Felt like I'd failed everybody. Your truck's running now, isn't it? Because of your palm oil fix, not because of me. Marcus looked up at the stars, visible here above the tree line. The same stars that hung over Philadelphia, over his father's garage, over every place he'd ever been where being colored meant being less than in someone else's eyes. Thompson, you know what my daddy told me when I first started working on engines? He said a good mechanic isn't the one who never has problems. A good mechanic is the one who doesn't quit when the problems come. You didn't quit. You kept that truck in line. You helped with the river crossing. You're here now making sure it keeps running. That's not failure, son. That's exactly what we need. Thompson nodded slowly, something easing in his shoulders. Thanks, Sarge. Get some rest. We roll again in 30. Marcus walked to the edge of the road, looking down into the valley where fog was gathering like spilled milk. Somewhere down there, somewhere in the dark, Chinese soldiers were waiting. Wounded men who needed morphine and bandages and hope. And the only thing standing between them and death was 20 trucks running on cooking oil and the desperate competence of men nobody back home would ever thank. Rodriguez appeared at his elbow. All trucks checked out, Sarge. Oil levels are good. Temperatures are stable. Whatever you did, it's holding. It's not what I did, Marcus said quietly. It's what those villagers knew all along. We just finally stopped being too proud to ask. The convoy mounted up. Engines rumbled to life, that beautiful, impossible sound of machines refusing to die. Marcus climbed into the lead truck, and Williams pointed them back onto the road that stretched ahead into darkness and distance, and the kind of uncertainty that war made normal. They drove through the remainder of the night, through a landscape that barely seemed like Earth anymore. And with every mile, Marcus Webb understood more clearly that this war wouldn't be won by the generals or the admirals or the pilots whose names would fill the history books. It would be won by men like him, like Jackson and Rodriguez and Thompson, doing impossible things with insufficient resources because the alternative was unthinkable. The cooking oil held, the engines sang, and somewhere ahead, in the pre-dawn darkness, men who'd been abandoned by hope heard the sound of trucks coming. Dawn broke over Burma like a wound opening. Marcus watched the sun climb through layers of mist and smoke, painting the sky in shades of blood orange and bruised purple. The convoy had been moving for 14 hours straight, and every man in every truck carried that exhaustion in his bones like shrapnel that couldn't be removed. They were close now. Marcus could feel it in the way the road changed. More traffic, more wear, the kind of damage that came from heavy military movement. Shell craters appeared more frequently, some fresh enough that the mud around them was still dark and wet. Burned vehicles lined the roadside like markers leading to some terrible destination. The radio crackled. Lead vehicle. This is command. You're 3 kilometers from rendezvous. Chinese forward positions should be visible soon. Proceed with caution. Area is not fully secure. Marcus keyed the mic. Copy, command. Any update on the situation? Static. Then Patterson's voice, more strained than before. Casualties are heavy, Sergeant. They've been holding position for 2 days waiting for resupply. Whatever you're bringing them, they need it now. Understood. Webb out. Williams glanced at Marcus, his young face drawn tight with something between fear and determination. Sarge, what if we're too late? Then we'll be too late. But we won't be too slow. Keep driving. The first sign of the Chinese position was the smell. Gunpowder and gangrene mixing in the humid air, a stench that made Marcus's eyes water even with the windows up. Then came the sound. The distinctive crack of rifles, the deeper boom of mortars, the irregular chatter of machine guns. A firefight, close enough to feel in your chest. The road curved around a ridge, and suddenly they could see it. A valley churned into moonscape by artillery, trees reduced to splintered stumps, the earth itself looking like it had been beaten. And dug into that ravaged landscape, barely visible behind makeshift fortifications, was what remained of the Chinese 38th Division. Marcus had seen combat positions before, but this was different. This wasn't a base or a fortification. This was a last stand that had somehow stretched into its third day. Foxholes carved into mud, machine gun nests built from sandbags and corpses, wounded men lying in rows under canvas shelters that offered shade but no protection from the shells that continued to fall every few minutes. A Chinese officer appeared, running toward the convoy with a desperation that transcended language barriers. He was shouting something, gesturing wildly toward the rear of the valley where smoke rose in dark columns. Chen jumped down from the third truck, his translation skills suddenly the most valuable asset in the convoy. The conversation was rapid, urgent, punctuated by the crump of incoming mortars. "He says the Japanese are preparing a major assault," Chen called out. "They've been probing all morning. The Chinese are almost out of ammunition. They've got maybe 2 hours of fighting left. Maybe less." Marcus looked at the 20 trucks behind him, each one carrying ammunition, medical supplies, food, and water. Everything these men needed to survive. Everything that had almost stayed stranded 50 miles back because American oil couldn't handle Burmese heat. "Tell him we've got what he needs, but we need to get these trucks unloaded before the Japanese hit. How long do we have?" More rapid conversation. The Chinese officer looked at the sky, at the pattern of the shelling, at some internal clock that combat experience had built into him. "He says 1 hour, maybe 90 minutes if we're lucky. Then we unload in 30. Jackson, Rodriguez, get every man on this. I want these trucks empty before the Japanese know we're here." What followed was controlled chaos. The convoy mechanics transformed into loaders, hauling crates of ammunition, cases of medical supplies, sacks of rice, and tins of rations. The Chinese soldiers who could still walk helped, working with the kind of frantic energy that came from knowing death was watching the clock. Marcus moved between the trucks, directing traffic, solving problems, keeping the operation flowing. Truck 8 had a stuck tailgate. Rodriguez fixed it with a crowbar and curses. Truck 15's ramp collapsed under the weight of ammunition crates. Thompson and Williams rigged a replacement using boards torn from destroyed bunkers. All around them, the war continued. Shells fell with random malice, throwing up geysers of mud and shrapnel. Somewhere in the tree line, Japanese snipers took opportunistic shots that spanged off truck panels and kicked up dirt around running men. But the work didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Marcus found the aid station, a muddy pit covered with blood-stained canvas, where a Chinese medic was working on a soldier whose leg was more tourniquet than limb. The medic looked up as Marcus approached, his eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who'd been doing triage for days without sleep. Marcus didn't speak Chinese and the medic didn't speak English, but some conversations didn't need words. Marcus gestured to the medical supplies being unloaded, made a question with his hands. The medic's face transformed. Relief, gratitude, disbelief. All flashing across features too young for what they'd seen. He grabbed Marcus's hand, shook it hard enough to hurt, then turned back to his patient with the energy that hadn't been there moments before. "Sarge," Jackson was running toward him, pointing back toward the convoy. "Truck 7's overheating again, temperatures climbing fast." Of course, because they couldn't just have 30 minutes of good luck. Marcus ran back to find Truck 7's hood already open, steam rising from the engine block in angry clouds. The palm oil was breaking down, finally surrendering to the impossible demands they'd placed on it. The engine block was glowing hot enough that Marcus could feel the heat from 3 feet away. "Shut it down," he ordered. "Let it cool. We'll drain the oil and replace it once we're done here. Sarge, we don't have any more palm oil. We used what we had." Marcus stared at the dying engine, at the convoy that had made it this far on cooking oil and determination, and felt something settle in his chest. They'd done it. They'd gotten the supplies here. One truck failing now didn't change that. Then we leave it. The Chinese need these supplies more than we need all 20 trucks running on the way back. Another shell fell, closer this time. Close enough that Marcus felt the concussion in his lungs. The Japanese were ranging in, getting the distance right. The real assault was coming. 15 minutes, Lieutenant Patterson was shouting. "I want every truck empty in 15 minutes. Move!" The pace became frantic. Men ran with loads too heavy for them, staggered under weights that should have required 2 people, pushed themselves past exhaustion into the territory where the body moves because the mind refuses to let it stop. Ammunition crates stacked up in Chinese fighting positions. Medical supplies disappeared into the aid station. Food and water distributed to men who looked like they'd forgotten those things existed. Marcus was hauling a crate of rifle ammunition when he saw the Chinese officer from earlier standing on a slight rise, looking down at the convoy with an expression that transcended language and culture, and the divisions that wars created between men. The officer met Marcus's eyes across the muddy distance and offered a salute, crisp, formal, loaded with meaning that no words could have carried. Marcus set down the crate and returned the salute. Two soldiers, two armies, two different worlds, connected for a moment by the simple fact that some men show up when other men need them. Then, the moment broke and the work continued. The last crate came off truck 20 with 3 minutes to spare. Marcus walked the line one final time, checking that every truck was empty, every tailgate secured, every man accounted for. His mechanics were exhausted, covered in mud and oil, and the particular grime that combat zones left on everything. But they were standing. They were whole. They'd done the impossible. Patterson appeared, his uniform soaked through with sweat, his face carrying an expression Marcus had never seen on it before. Something like respect. Something like awe. Sergeant Webb. Patterson's voice was hoarse. I need to say something. Sir, we should mount up. The Japanese can wait 30 seconds. Patterson stepped closer. When I was given this assignment, I thought it was punishment. A supply convoy with colored mechanics, running supplies to Chinese forces that High Command barely acknowledged existed. I thought I'd drawn the short straw. Marcus waited, not sure where this was going. I was wrong. What you men did, keeping these trucks running on palm oil, getting them through that river crossing, delivering these supplies when every regulation said it was impossible, that's the kind of soldiering they'll never put in the manuals because it can't be taught. It has to be lived. Sir, I'm recommending you for a Bronze Star, Sergeant. You and your men saved lives today. Chinese lives, which means Allied lives, which means this matters. Regardless of what some generals think about colored units or Chinese forces or any of the politics that put us out here, this matters. Marcus looked at Patterson and saw something he hadn't expected. A white officer from a good family learning in real time that competence and courage didn't come in only one color. It wouldn't change the army. Probably wouldn't change Patterson once they got back to base and the old structures reasserted themselves. But for now, in this moment, on this muddy road in Burma, something had shifted. Thank you, sir. But we should really... The Japanese mortar barrage that had been sporadic all morning suddenly intensified. A drumbeat of explosions that walked across the valley like a giant's footsteps. The assault was beginning. Mount up, Marcus shouted. Every truck now! We're moving out! The convoy fired up, 19 engines roaring to life. Truck 7 sat silent, its engine too damaged to start, but 18 more than Marcus had thought they'd have 2 hours ago was enough. It was more than enough. They pulled out as the first Japanese infantry appeared on the ridgeline, silhouettes against the rising sun, screaming and charging into the Chinese positions with bayonets fixed. But now the Chinese were shooting back with full magazines, coordinated fire, the steady defense of men who had what they needed to fight. The last thing Marcus saw as the convoy climbed out of the valley was a Chinese soldier firing a new rifle with ammunition that had come off Marcus's convoy, his face set with the particular determination of a man who'd been written off and had decided to prove everyone wrong. The convoy drove into the morning, leaving the battle behind but carrying it with them in the sound of sustained gunfire that said the line was holding. The position was secure. The supplies had arrived in time. Williams was grinning, the first smile Marcus had seen on the kid's face in days. We did it, Sarge. We actually did it. We did our job, Williams. That's all. But it wasn't all. And Marcus knew it. They'd done more than their job. They'd proven something that the army didn't want proven. That colored men could improvise, innovate, lead, succeed in situations where white officers had failed. They'd shown that solutions sometimes came from unexpected places, from palm oil and Burmese villagers and mechanics who'd learned to listen to what engines needed. The road ahead was long. The war was far from over. And tomorrow they'd face new problems, new breakdowns, new impossible situations that they'd somehow have to solve. But today, 20 trucks running on cooking oil had saved lives that everyone else had written off as already lost. Today was enough. The convoy limped back to base 3 days later, 19 trucks instead of 20, running on oil that shouldn't have worked but did. Marcus sat in the passenger seat of the lead truck, watching the jungle roll past with eyes that saw everything and registered nothing. Exhaustion had gone past physical into something deeper, a weariness that settled in the soul and made everything feel distant, like watching life happen to someone else. They'd heard the battle continue for 6 hours after they'd pulled out. The sustained gunfire had gradually faded as the convoy put miles between themselves and the valley, but Marcus had kept listening until there was nothing but jungle sounds and engine noise. Later, Patterson had received word via radio. The Chinese 38th Division had held. The Japanese assault had broken against prepared positions defended by men who finally had the ammunition to fight back. Casualties were heavy on both sides, but the line held. The supplies had arrived in time. That was all that mattered. The base appeared through the trees like a mirage. Rows of tents, repair depots, supply dumps, the organized chaos of a rear echelon that kept the war moving forward. Marcus felt nothing at the sight of it. No relief, no joy, just the numb acknowledgement that they'd completed the loop and returned to where they'd started. The convoy rolled through the gates and parked in formation. Engines shut down one by one, that beautiful rumbling silence that meant the machines could finally rest. Men climbed down from cabs, moving like old men, like the 3-day mission had aged them 3 years. Marcus walked the line one last time, checking each truck with the same careful attention he'd given them throughout the mission. Oil levels, tire wear, structural damage, all the small wounds that the road had inflicted. At truck 12 he found Thompson already under the hood, checking the palm oil level. "How's she looking, Thompson?" "Oil's dark, Sarge, real dark, but it's still oil." Thompson pulled the dipstick, held it to the light. "Didn't think it would last this long?" "Neither did I," Marcus admitted. "But engines are funny things. Sometimes they'll run on hope if that's all you give them." "That what we were running on, hope?" Marcus looked at the young private, at the mechanics gathering around their trucks, at the 19 vehicles that had defied every regulation and expectation to complete their mission. "We were running on something better than hope, son. We were running on the knowledge that quitting wasn't an option." Over the next week, the story spread through the base like smoke through bamboo. The colored mechanics who'd kept a convoy running on cooking oil. The impossible mission that had somehow succeeded. Men who'd heard the story would walk past the motor pool just to see the trucks, like they were artifacts from some legend rather than just GMC 2.5 tons covered in mud and wear. But the official reports told a different story. Or rather, they told no story at all. The mission was logged as a routine supply delivery. The palm oil innovation wasn't mentioned. The names of the mechanics who'd made it possible were absent from every document that mattered. Marcus read the after-action report in Lieutenant Patterson's tent, feeling something harden in his chest with each omission. "They're not going to acknowledge it," he said flatly. Patterson looked uncomfortable, like a man caught between what was right and what was possible. The Bronze Star recommendations were rejected. Command feels that the mission, while successful, doesn't meet the criteria for decoration. We saved an entire division. A Chinese division. Which apparently makes it different. Patterson couldn't meet Marcus's eyes. "I argued. I submitted additional documentation. I tried everything I could, Sergeant. But there are politics at play here that go beyond this base, beyond Burma, beyond anything I have authority to change." Marcus set down the report. "And the palm oil? The innovation that kept those trucks running when they should have died?" "Noted in my report. Classified as field expedient maintenance. No special commendation. No recognition of the ingenuity involved." Patterson finally looked up. "I'm sorry, Sergeant Webb. You and your men deserved better." "We've always deserved better, Lieutenant. That's not news to us." Marcus walked out of the tent into afternoon heat that felt like breathing water. Around the base, life continued. Supply clerks moving crates, officers studying maps, white soldiers going about their duties with the casual confidence of men who knew their contributions would be remembered. That night, Marcus gathered his men in the motor pool. Jackson, Rodriguez, Thompson, Williams, Chen, and a dozen others who'd kept the convoy running through impossible circumstances. They sat on truck bumpers and wooden crates, sharing cigarettes and the kind of exhausted silence that came after pushing past every limit. "I got the official word today," Marcus said. "No medals, no commendations. The report mentions the mission but not how we completed it. Far as the Army's concerned, we just drove some trucks." "Figured as much," Jackson said, no surprise in his voice. "They don't give medals to colored men for being smart. Brave, maybe, if enough white officers see it. But smart, that makes them uncomfortable." "So what do we do?" Thompson asked. "We just accept that what we did doesn't matter?" Marcus looked at the young private, seeing in him all the hope and anger and confusion that came from serving a country that needed you but wouldn't acknowledge you. "What we did matters, Thompson. Whether they write it down or not. Those Chinese soldiers are alive because of us. That's real. That's permanent. No report can erase that." "But nobody will know," Williams said quietly. 50 years from now, nobody will know that colored mechanics saved that convoy with cooking oil. They'll read about Burma and see white generals and white pilots and think that's who won the war." "Maybe," Marcus acknowledged. "Probably. But we'll know, and we'll tell our children, and they'll tell theirs. And the truth has a way of surviving even when the official story tries to bury it." Rodriguez leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You really believe that, Sarge? That the truth survives?" Marcus thought about his father's garage in Philadelphia, about all the innovations and improvisations that colored mechanics had developed over decades because they couldn't afford genuine parts and weren't allowed into white shops, about the knowledge that got passed down hand to hand, generation to generation, never written in manuals but alive in the work itself. "I believe that what we do echoes," Marcus said. "Maybe not in the way we want, maybe not in the official histories, but somewhere, somehow, it matters. We kept faith with those Chinese soldiers. We did our jobs when doing our jobs was impossible. That means something, even if the only people who know are sitting in this motor pool right now." Chen spoke up, his voice thoughtful. "My grandfather has a saying, 'The mountain doesn't need the map to know it's tall.' We know what we did. That has to be enough." "Does it?" Thompson's voice cracked slightly. "Does it really have to be enough that we know when everybody else gets their names in the papers?" Marcus didn't have a good answer for that. The truth was that it wasn't enough, wasn't fair, wasn't right. But it was what they had. "Listen to me," he said, his voice carrying the weight of all the exhaustion and frustration and pride he felt. "Every one of you could have quit. When those engines started failing, when the oil broke down, when we hit that river, you could have said it was impossible and nobody would have blamed you. Nobody expected colored mechanics to solve a problem that white engineers couldn't prevent." He paused, making sure each man heard what came next. "But you didn't quit. You tried something crazy. You trusted palm oil from a Burmese village more than you trusted American petroleum engineering. And you were right. That kind of thinking, that's how real problems get solved. Not in laboratories with unlimited resources, but in the field with insufficient supplies and too much to lose." "So, what happens now?" Jackson asked. "We just go back to regular duties? Pretend it was routine?" "We go back to being what we've always been," Marcus said. "The best mechanics in this theater, running on half the supplies and twice the ingenuity of anyone else. And when the next impossible mission comes, and it will come, we'll figure out how to complete that one too." The men sat in silence, processing this, accepting the unfairness because they'd been accepting unfairness their entire lives. But something had changed in them. Marcus could see it in the way they held themselves. The quiet confidence that came from proving something to themselves even if they couldn't prove it to the Army. Later, alone in his tent, Marcus wrote a letter to his father. He described the mission in detail, the failing engines, the village, the palm oil solution, the river crossing, the desperate unloading under fire. He wrote about Thompson's crisis of confidence and Williams' questions and the Chinese officer's salute. He wrote it all down because someone had to document what really happened, even if that document never made it into any official archive. At the end of the letter he wrote, "You taught me to listen to engines, Pop. To hear what they need, even when they can't tell you in words. Turns out that skill works on more than just machines. Sometimes you have to listen to what a whole situation needs, even when regulations and procedures are telling you something different. Sometimes the solution is cooking oil and the courage to trust it. I don't know if what we did here will matter in the long run. The army sure doesn't think it matters. But those Chinese soldiers are alive, and that has to count for something. That has to mean we're not just spare parts in someone else's war. I hope I made you proud, Pop. Even if nobody else knows what we did, I hope you would have been proud. He sealed the letter and set it aside to mail in the morning. Outside, the jungle night was alive with sounds. Insects and birds and the distant rumble of transport trucks moving supplies up the Ledo road. The war ground on, indifferent to the small victories and large injustices that made up its daily operation. Marcus lay on his cot, staring at the canvas ceiling, and thought about legacy. About what got remembered and what got forgotten. About the countless colored soldiers doing extraordinary things in this war, who would never receive recognition, never see their names in history books, never get the acknowledgement they deserved. But then he thought about those Chinese soldiers, alive because 19 trucks had run on cooking oil and determination. He thought about the mechanics who'd proven to themselves what they were capable of when the situation demanded it. He thought about the knowledge they'd carry forward, that improvisation and innovation weren't failures of protocol, but survival skills in a world that rarely gave you exactly what you needed. Maybe that was enough. Not justice, not equality, not the recognition they deserved. But enough to keep going, keep fighting, keep proving over and over again that competence and courage weren't the exclusive property of the men who got their names in newspapers. The cooking oil had held when petroleum engineering failed. That was a fact, regardless of whether any report acknowledged it. And facts, Marcus believed, had a way of surviving even in the spaces between official histories. He closed his eyes and let exhaustion finally take him, dreaming of engines that ran on impossible things and roads that led to places the maps never showed. Somewhere in the Burmese jungle, a convoy of trucks sat cooling in the night, their engines silent, but their story still echoing in the lives they'd saved, and the men who'd driven them beyond what anyone thought possible. And in a motor pool that history would forget, colored mechanics slept the sleep of men who knew their worth even when the world refused to acknowledge it. The war would continue. The missions would keep coming. And when they did, Marcus Webb and his men would be ready. Not because the army valued them, not because they'd receive recognition, but because some things mattered more than medals. Some things mattered because they were simply, undeniably right. And that, in the end, was a kind of victory that no report could take away.